So our first speaker for the day is Jeffrey Emmett. Jeff is actually one of the regulars in our calls, and he works with both BlockScience and Giveth. So Jeff, welcome to take it away.
So yeah, I guess in 15 minutes, we don't really have a ton of time to go into detail. So maybe I'll just give a quick overview of the broad scope of what we're looking to do. And I think of most interest to people in this channel will be our bonding curve implementation. So we've actually been working with a number of groups between Giveth, BlockScience, Onward Labs, and Abby is the head of strategy at Onward Labs. So she'll be helping to walk through the token bonding curve implementation as we have it so far, and explain that a bit once I do the overview. So I'm currently working with Giveth, and I think that's a fairly well-known group, building the future of charity. So I came on looking at curation markets as a specific use case for or a technology to implement what Giveth is looking to build. Basically, we're looking to build economies around causes to enable emergent solutions to whatever charitable issue is on the table. And we started working closely with BlockScience because we realized that they have the most advanced research and really great ideas towards building out what we're calling a common stack. So that involves a token bonding curve, that could involve TCR, which we're currently working on a biomimetic TCR called conviction voting. It also includes a couple other modules that will be built out. So the common stack, where the first step is building out this token bonding curve. So let me just see if I can share my screen here, and maybe Abby can help walk through us. Can everybody see my screen? Good? Okay, great. So the overall, you there, Abby?
Yeah, I can walk through kind of, if you actually want to show the bigger diagram first, like the big thing. Cool. So hi guys, I'm Abby. So I'm head of strategy at Onward Labs right now, and have kind of come into this, space working with communicating Z's augmented bonding curve design in relation to like an actual functional use case, which is basically crowdfunding commons, or just creating a continuous funding mechanism for public good commons. So Z's bonding curve design is actually something called like an augmented bonding curve. So the reason that it's augmented is because it's a regular bonding curve, basically designed, that has a token pool, that has a reserve that is DAI and bonded a supply of tokens that can be used to buy, sell, and be attributed to actual governing rights within a commons. So a typical bonding curve, I would say, but what's augmented about it is that the whole system is attached to a floating funding pool of actual non-bonded DAI that can be used and allocated as capital within a commons. So the whole point of a commons is to fund and allocate capital to labor that positively impacts and is beneficial impact for the commons. And so this whole system connects the bonding and minting of tokens to the funding of this pool that can then be used and distributed to, here in this diagram, you see, goes right into funding real impact of commons labor. So the way that it's connected is that the bonding curve works and initializes in 3 phases. And so this is the first time I've explained this beyond phone calls with Z's. So I would love your guys' feedback on how this works. So there's 3 phases. So in the first phase, there's an open phase. So there's an initial collection of funds to actually start the commons by funding necessary initial goals. So this is more of like a user kind of up there. It's really just putting money into the curve and that it sets it up for success. So this is basically like contributors actually just donate fiat that could turn into DAI deposited directly into the funding pool, which, as you saw in the other diagram, was that blue floating pool of DAI. This gives the contributor the right to participate in the hatching of the system. So that's kind of, yes, exactly. Thank you, Jeff. So the hatching phase is where things get interesting. So the hatching phase was created to minimize the early harmful speculation that we attribute to like the Ponzi scheme-ness of token bonding curves, right? So in this hatching phase, members can participate, aka buying tokens in the pre-sale of the token pool. So they deposit fiat into DAI, which gets deposited into the reserve, and they receive tokens of the bonding curve in return, right? Earlier contributors, and so this is all laid out on a curve. Earlier contributors will probably get more tokens, later get less. But the point of this is that the tokens are actually locked on minting. So members entered this like slow vesting period where tokens are slowly unlocked in relation to the change in rebonded DAI and the state variables of the entire curve. So let me walk through that sentence. So with the lockup, the tokens are locked for an initial point of time, right? So when tokens are locked, there's like a soft block, basically. The burn and sell of these tokens are disabled, but they can be used to make decisions. For example, in like a conviction voting module or any other governance that's kind of layered on top of this system. So while tokens are locked, you can't sell them. So you can't sell them directly for returns, and the speculation, the harmful speculation that we see and just maximizing profit returns within a curve are basically disabled until the curve reaches a certain goal, which is really just like a fundraising goal in crowdfunding terms, right? Once it reaches this certain goal, which can be a period of time or like a fundraising goal, just how many people, how many tokens are in supply or locked, the members enter this vesting period. So tokens are slowly unlocked as the cumulative allocated assets increase, right? So this is where, if you actually want to go back to the other diagram, Jeff, for a second, where if we look at this greater diagram, if you see when tokens are unlocked and they can be burned, they go to this major, the one in the center, the burn, yeah, right there, and then they go to the burn withdraw there, and they are actually they can be, when they're unlocked, they can be burned and sold by members. So there's two things here. One, when tokens are burned or sold, there's actually like a liquidation friction fee that sends a small percentage of that burned return back into the funding pool. So this funding pool is constantly grown and is being continuously funded by the actually burning and selling of tokens. So this is where the funding, this is like the augmented part of the bonding curve. So when members cash out and liquidate their tokens for DAI or for fiat, a small percentage of their returns goes back into the funding pool. So even when people are, even if there's arbitrageurs and speculators, that funding is still going back into the pool. The second thing, the tokens are not just unlocked all at one point in time, right? There can be an initial unlocking period that is based off of, we reach this goal, now we can unlock this percentage of tokens. But after that, there's like a slow drip process in which tokens are only unlocked for burning and selling based off of how much cumulative assets are allocated to fund labor. So this is where that big silo in the diagram comes into play, is that when I allocate money from my funding pool to labor, it doesn't just go in DAI and then gets, it doesn't just go from DAI to be sold. It actually, DAI is allocated from the funding pool to the labor, and the DAI is rebonded into the curve. So this is where you see there's a huge arrow that goes back into the curve. When the DAI is rebonded, then tokens are distributed for people to cover expenses and fund the labor of the commons. And so when they burn those tokens that are unlocked to cover their expenses for their labor that they use to benefit the commons, a part of that goes back into the funding pool. So basically, I'm talking too much and I'm going to end there. But basically, you're creating this self-sustaining and continuously funded ecosystem by introducing this funding pool. And so there's a lot of questions here on how we judge how we enter from phase to phase. So what are the fundraising goals? And that's something that I'm working on right now, on how do we communicate that. But everything is very much so algorithmically tied to how the state variables of the system are dynamically changing at any point, right? And this is what Z has been talking about by like biomimetic systems. And sorry, Michael Zargam, I keep calling him Z, and I guess everybody doesn't refer to him as Z. And by achieving a dynamic equilibrium of the system. And that's kind of what I think is really cool about this design. So Jeff, you should fill in all the things that I missed.
Yeah, so this is definitely probably a lot to everybody who hasn't looked at this stuff before. So this is kind of all of these diagrams that we've shown so far are basically a kind of token circuit diagram. So these more or less can be ported directly into CAD. And CAD is BlockScience's new simulation and modeling tool. So all of these diagrams are more or less the equivalent of a circuit diagram that you would plug into, a circuit simulation tool like Spice. But you can plug these into a complex systems engineering tool, which we're calling CAD. And all of this can be simulated to determine how this system will react under various circumstances. So also, all of these diagrams have been sorted out from first principles. So they are this friction fee. I mean, there are lots of token bonding curves that have worked kind of with the different phi curves and the cell curve. This is more or less the same thing. There is a small loss to the person taking a profit. So when he's looking to sell the token on the token bonding curve, he earns a bit less than if he were to buy at that exact same point. And that friction, that what we're calling a friction fee, because we're using kind of the natural systems approach. So we're calling that a friction, and that friction fee is redirected into the labor pool. So all of those friction fees add up and they feed the commons. They grow that labor pool of resources that can pay people to do work in whatever commons we're building. So we're kind of keeping this like a blank slate. So ultimately our goal when this common stack is built out is that anyone can create a commons for whatever they're looking to do. Right now, we are just focusing on creating a commons around the research of token engineering. So there are lots of different groups, lots of different communities, all doing research on various aspects of these crypto economic primitives. And we're seeing that there could be a lot more to be gained by collaborating rather than everyone working in separate silos. And part of the issue with that is, we have been talking with Michael Zargham from BlockScience, and they have been doing incredible research and development. But the problem with open sourcing their research and development is that, it's the same issue with incentivizing open source anywhere. Anyone can come in and take that research, and BlockScience is all of a sudden out in the streets and can't afford to pay their incredible staff of researchers and PhDs, and they have quite a all-star staff, but they also need to continue developing this research. So we are kind of looking to create this token engineering commons that can incentivize everyone in all of these various communities to come together around this research and work to build these robust, sustainable, modeled, simulated crypto economic primitives and turn them into kind of this useful common stack that can be used by almost any project. I mean, not that it would be a straight clone of the repo. There would probably be some parameters to change here and there, but at least we would have kind of a ground level to work from. Does that make sense? Is there anything in particular that people have questions about? I know we covered a lot there, and I'm not sure what time we're at. Are we at 15 minutes yet? Maybe we've gone over that.
I think we're just about at 15 minutes, so I'm happy if you guys would like to maybe take any questions if there are any questions. That was I'm gonna have to rewatch this, I think, too. I'm trying to get everything, but I think
there's actually, so I'm actually working on a deeper technical article on this that is kind of walking through everything that I just kind of threw at you guys.
Okay.
So you get through the test bed for that article. So that will hopefully come out by the end of this week. And I'll be sure to have Jeff share that with this group. So to get everybody's feedback and stuff, because there's a lot there.
Perfect. Are you releasing it on your Medium page for BlockScience? Or?
Yeah, it'll be on my personal Medium page, but it'll be all over Twitter, and BlockScience will be tagged and everything. This is kind of what this is based off of BlockScience's research, but this is very much so within the use case that they're building towards, which is commons, right? So it's a separate but similar project that has been growing. off of BlockScience's research. And so we actually have a couple teams at the upcoming Odyssey Hackathon in Amsterdam who are going to be building kind of the actual implementations for this bonding curve, for the conviction voting module, for the curation markets, implementation. So we're trying to align around a product vision and kind of really start creating a narrative around it.
Brilliant. I think it's a great start, and we'd be happy to try and support you as much as possible, I think, as well.
Awesome.
Larry asked if the flowchart will be made available as well. Will that come with your article?
Yeah, 100%. And there'll be a better one that's like way clearer. This is like straight from the source, that we've been trying to do. So I will be sure to share that diagram that will really, really get into making this as clear as possible. So look out for that.
Good.
It'll be coming out in plain English very soon.
Yeah, not alien speak.
No, I think that was great. Thank you so much, Abby, and thanks, Jeff. We haven't had any questions come through on the chat yet, but does anyone else want to ask anything?
Yeah, I have a couple questions if now's a good time for that.
Yeah.
I was curious, what do you consider the biggest assumptions that are inputs to this model, and how do those impact how you would parameterize your bonding curve? And have you guys figured out an optimal way to parameterize the curve based on some assumed objective function?
Cool. Can I take that quickly, Jeff, and then you hop in? So so a couple things there. So I think the key questions that I have for the parameterization of the curve, or just the system in general, is kind of one, what is this open phase in which contributors are kind of setting up the curve for success? So there's a lot of, and I think about it on the user level. Again, I'm a design strategist, kind of, tech product person, right? So I'm thinking of it as in the use case, right? So how do you set these phase to phase transitions? What are the thresholds for phase transitions that open up different aspects of the system? And so right now, there's a lot of ways to analytically look at that. There's a lot of ways to arbitrarily look at that, right? And so what we're doing at Odyssey is actually trying to, one, mathematically model it, but also implement it in Solidity with a couple of these assumptions to test. So that's something that we're definitely testing. And then what was the second part to your question? Because I had a second answer and then I forgot what you asked.
What are the main inputs, assumption inputs to your model?
Yeah, and then the assumptions that are going into this are, one huge assumption that needs to be solved, and that's again why we're tackling this in April, is the governance of the actual allocation of capital. If the cumulative allocated assets are determining the vesting period for members, right, and slowly unlocking tokens, then there needs to be a really great curation market governance type model that allows for the true allocation of capital, meaning true within and it aligns with the incentives of the system and the contributors within the system. So I think that there's this governance layer that is kind of shrouding this whole system that needs to be really fleshed out and tested to make sure that this system actually works and that the curve even is successful. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so I think if I understood the first part of your answer correctly, you're saying that instead of having a continuous bonding curve, you're thinking of the bonding curve more in terms of thresholds. So would your curve be a series of step functions based on meaningful phase transitions, you hit some capital milestone and then it becomes more expensive to participate? Or are you still thinking in terms of a continuous curve where using some exponential curve or S curve, it becomes continuously more expensive to get a share of the commons by staking DAI?
Yeah, so I'll try to use these definitions that I've been slowly learning, and we'll see if that is actually a valid answer. But basically, the system first, the curve is logarithmic, right? So it's a different type of curve that we're looking at, specifically in the parameters. But second, it is kind of representing this event-driven, differential equation almost, right? So it's basically combining the concept of having step functions and phase transitions with a continuous curve. And this is what makes the system, and Jeff, jump in if I'm not making any sense. But this is kind of from what I've understood is really cool about this, because you are introducing these phase transitions, which allow the system to achieve this dynamic equilibrium that's actually creating a self-sustaining module by the phases, right? So I think that there will be situations in which the price may increase for people coming in post phases, but that is almost introducing a level of responsibility and a level of accountability within the system that is setting it up for success, is how I would answer that question. Again, take everything I say with an asterisk, because we're totally figuring this out as we go along.
For sure.
I can add a little bit to that. So as far as the assumptions being made, we are trying to stay as open and as assumption free as possible. There are a lot of parameters. A lot of those parameters are not necessarily locked down for our specific implementation or for any implementation that uses this model. So a lot of those parameters and assumptions can be determined at the community level. Whatever community wants to use this bonding curve model can choose which, for example, the forgetfulness factor. So Abby mentioned, the vesting period. It is not all tokens are locked, all tokens are locked, all tokens are locked, all tokens are free. It would be a vesting curve. So all of this follows kind of like fluid dynamics. So you don't have these second order effects of having no tokens and then suddenly switching to all tokens free. You have these sort of like volatility issues. So for example, the curve that the vesting period follows is an assumption, but we don't say it has to be this curve. That parameter can be decided by whatever community that wants to use this system. So as far as those assumptions go, we're trying to keep it as open as possible.
This might be a better comment for the conversation at the end, but I wonder if there's a different way you would design these curves based on whether your objective is to maximize investment in the curve versus maximize the signal produced by the curve. So our protocol, which is the graph, and I know other protocols like Ocean and Foam are looking at curation token bonding curves for the signal that they produce. It seems like in your case, the commons, you're actually looking to maximize the investment in the curve and as well as effective governance of that investment. Because your goal is to produce this commons of capital that can be deployed.
Right. So we're actually looking at the token bonding curve that we are essentially building is not a price and supply two-dimensional bonding curve. It would be more like a dynamic bonding curve. You could think of it like a plane or a manifold that it responds to different system variables. So at any point in time, you can take a slice of that plane and that gives you the curve under the appropriate system situation. So you can take, the plane may take different shapes if, for example, the pool has less resources available, perhaps the price of the token would go up to encourage people to sell and take a profit and thus replenish the pool with the exit fees. So you can have the curve responding to different scenarios within the ecosystem, and those whatever variables those are responding to can be determined by the community that is setting up the curve. If that made sense.
I think so. Yeah, I have more questions, but I'll leave room for others to jump in.
I just have a quick question. I really like the idea. We've got a curation market right now using bonding curves, and the biggest issue we've ran into since we went on LiveNet is specifically pump and dump bonding curves, because we're letting people just pick their own function that's connected to MetaMask, so it's really easy for them to go in and out. And it's craziness right now. So I really, really like the idea of locking tokens in addition to having the bonding curve essentially pay back into itself on the way out. Do you guys have anything else specific that you're thinking trying out just specifically to mitigate the pump and dump bonding curves?
So
right now,
we're kind of using, sorry, go ahead, Abby.
No, go ahead. It's okay.
I was just going to say we're basically planning for speculation, and we're using speculation as an engine that provides resources to the commons. So if there are people buying and selling, as long as it is within a healthy range of the system, people selling from the system when they exit the system, we are taking a small friction fee on that. So we're saying, feel free to take your profits. That's a beneficial thing. Thank you for donating and providing resources to this commons. And it's not a bad thing for you to take profits, but we are also going to take a small friction fee of that and use it to fund the labor pool which will allow more work to come through the commons. So we are kind of like utilizing speculative behavior. And I mean, obviously, if you have extreme pumps and dumps, that's an issue. But if you can design the curve to have that volatility within specific ranges, we're hoping that we can keep that within a more reasonable area. And of course, we'll be doing lots of simulations on this. We'll be programming profit-seeking bots and running those through our simulations as well. So we'll be able to see if there are, you know, specific failure modes that we need to look out for before deploying this, before even, you know, implementing on testnet.
Yeah, and I think the only thing I'll add to that is really just messing around with the locking mechanism of like actually what are the variables that are informing the algorithm that defines the vesting period, right? So how many tokens are unlocked and when, and how is that also attached to how many tokens are in supply and what is the reserve at any point in time. So not only just saying, not just using a temporal, a variable to affect the vesting period, and not just using, you know, the state variables of like how much rebonded DAI is going back into the system based off of how much capital is allocated, but also using the system analysis of like what are the token supply at any point in time? Meaning if we are at a low point in the commons, right, and we don't have a lot of money, then we shouldn't be doing certain things, and we should not be unlocking tokens at the same rate. You see what I'm saying? So kind of taking in different variables of the system and figuring out what works is kind of like what we're focusing on the technical side right now when we're trying to create an implementation of this. And so I'm really excited to see how that informs most of these questions that we have about decreasing harmful speculation while taking the benefits of it to, you know, keep and I saw a question in the chat about how this is self-sustaining. I think the liquidation fee is really what is self-sustaining in the pool, right? But it's also the increase. This system keeps growing. There is speculation, there is arbitrage, right? And that taking the best parts of that to allow for the system to keep getting that capital inflow. And just also the other point that I wanted to make is that contributors can donate to this funding pool at any point in time, right? So in that yellow box, like anybody can contribute to the funding pool and it can be used to sustain the system. So this is also just building into our current systems of how public goods are currently funded.
Gotcha. I really appreciate that. And I'm a big fan of the, right now it's just crazy with we're letting people use their own functions. So I think having the vesting period, the way that you described, rather than us trying to like, I don't know, have it sort of internally decided based on variables and trying that out, I think we might just make that a variable for people to enter and let you know how that goes for sure. I think that's an awesome option.
Cool. Cool, guys. I'm going to cut this one here just for interest of keeping with a little bit of time. So our next presenter for the evening is William George from Kleros, and Kleros is a decentralized justice protocol offering a radically different approach to dispute resolution. So I'm going to let him tell you more about that. And I think he would also, William, you said you're going to be presenting on curated lists as well?
Yep, that's right. So at Kleros, we're a general dispute resolution process, or general dispute resolution platform. So we imagine that at some point people like freelancers will use our platform to handle potential freelancing disputes if like someone doesn't do a good job trying to get a reimbursement. But we also imagine Kleros being used for curated lists, because at the end of the day, whether something belongs on a curated list or not, whether something satisfies the criteria to be on a curated list is a dispute. You might have two parties that say, one, this belongs on the list, and another says that this does not belong on the list. So we've had a number of experiments with we've experimented with curated lists so far. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about our experiments to this point, and then sort of our future directions where we're going in the near future. So I have a set of slides that I can hopefully share. Okay, do people, no, that's not showing the slides.
Nope, cool, now it's showing.
Oh, okay, you see the slides?
Yeah.
Great, okay, so our very first sort of launch of Kleros was a curated list of Doge images. Why can't I go down? Okay, there we go. So you see the Doges on trial thing? Yeah, good. So our first launch of Kleros was a curated list of meme images because we wanted to sort of start with small and low stakes. So as sort of like simple as a setup as this is, it's still like, it's still a curated list. There's still sort of interesting things that can go on. Ultimately, the underlying dispute here that our jurors would resolve are, does an image belong on this list? And in order to belong on the list, it needs to be one of these Doge images. And we offered a variety of incentives for people to either submit Doge images. We offered Dogecoin to people who submitted Dogecoins, or we offered bounties and prizes to people who managed to get a cat on the list. So there was both an incentive to sort of try to simulate the natural incentives for people that would want to both get on the list for honest and also malicious purposes. So I'm going to tell you about a variety of kind of things we observed in the context of this experiment, and then show you where we're going in the future with token curated lists. So there were a few different roles here. People could submit an image. They could pay a deposit to challenge that image. The submitter also pays a deposit. If you successfully challenge an image, you get part of the deposit of the submitter. And then also, like, ultimately, the decision of whether something belongs on the list or not was made by Kleros jurors. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Kleros, in order to be Kleros juror, you have to have some of the Kleros Panakion token, and you stake it in one of our courts, saying that you're willing to act as a juror. And then when there's a dispute, a certain number of tokens are randomly drawn, and then those people are given votes to rule on the dispute. And then if there's also an appeal process where if you're unhappy with the ruling as one of the two parties, conceivably you can appeal and then draw more jurors and more jurors. So that it gets to the point that even though if you're starting with a relatively small number of jurors that aren't necessarily putting in too much effort looking at these images of doges and trying to determine whether or not they belong on the list, as you go on and draw more and more jurors, you draw ultimately like a very broad representative pool of the total token holders, and it becomes hard to bribe them, for example. So I will talk about some of the experiments we did and some of the observations we made. So first of all, we did some experiments with bribes to see sort of how effective they were, different kinds of bribes. So like this image of the cat with the Tower of Babel, this was placed, submitted into the list. And as you can see here, there's this like text at the bottom that alerts the jurors to the possibility that there is a bribe. So jurors could see when they saw the image to tell them whether or not to rule on whether or not this belongs on the list. They would see that, oh, there's a possibility of a bribe, and they would have like this forum link to look for further information. So specifically, we did a number of P plus epsilon bribes. In addition, there were a couple of sort of classical simple bribes that were submitted to the list that weren't particularly successful. But we were particularly interested in sort of the special kind of bribe called a P plus epsilon attack. This was an attack considered by Vitalik. I recommend his blog post on P plus epsilon attacks if you're interested. But the basic idea is that in a normal sort of situation, a Kleros juror is rewarded for being coherent with the other jurors. So if you vote the same way that the other jurors vote, you get a reward. And if you vote opposite of how the other jurors vote, you lose a deposit. You're penalized. So you sort of have this situation where, like, if the majority votes X, you want to vote X, and if the majority votes Y, you want to vote Y. But a P plus epsilon attack offers a bribe to people who vote Y if and only if X wins, which creates a very interesting situation where voting Y becomes a dominant strategy because if you vote Y and the majority is X, well, you get P plus epsilon instead of voting P, which is what you would have gotten if you voted X. And if you vote Y and the majority is Y, well, then you're coherent. The attacker doesn't pay you out a bribe, but because you're coherent, you do better than you would have if you voted X. So it sort of warps the incentive mechanism of a Schelling point-based voting system. So this seems very problematic to us as ultimately like as a Schelling point-based kind of project. So we wanted to see sort of how effective these bribes were, and see if we could make design choices around Kleros in a way to reduce their effectiveness. So we did a number of these attacks, and for the most part, the jurors didn't take the bribes. Like none of the images that were submitted with an attack like this were ultimately accepted by the jurors, and some people took the attack, but in the sort of the most extreme case, only around 30% of people ever took the bribe. So there are some questions about why that might be. So we have a couple of theories. So first of all, note that this was extremely unlikely to occur if you think that even a juror would take the bribe with 50% chance. This is like wildly like these results are extreme. So it's clear that our sort of juror pool was unwilling to take these bribes in a statistically meaningful way. So even this like sort of like p-value of the like 0.0001 is actually probably an overestimate of the uncertainty of whether or not our given juror pool at the time we did these bribes was willing to accept bribes. Because in fact, some of the attacks we did were so large that we basically drew everyone that was participating. So we almost performed like a census on people and their willingness to take bribes, at least in our sort of early juror pool. And it's worth noting that most of our token holders either always took the bribe or never took the bribe. So whether people took bribes appears to be very, very much a psychology of them. So for like larger bribes or smaller bribes, it didn't seem to make much of a difference. People were pretty much either bribe friendly or not. So why might this have happened this way? So for one thing, we note that there's a cognitive cost to understanding the attack. So beyond the fact that the P plus epsilon attack is sort of a complicated attack, moreover, even though like you can create a smart contract that enforces the bribe, that it guarantees you to get the bribe if you vote the way the attacker wants you to vote. Like ultimately, that smart contract could have like bugs and trapdoors, and if you're a voter, you might not trust the attacker to give you a trapdoor-free contract. So there is some effort that would be expected from you to like go through and review the contract yourself. And for some people, that may have not been worth that cognitive cost. So a lot of our people, like our early jurors, when we did this, may have just been very altruistic. There are people who were sort of enthusiastic about the project early on, and they may have been less likely than sort of normal average people drawn from the general population to accept the bribes because they want Kleros to succeed, and particularly maybe because they want Klaus to succeed because they already hold some of the PNK token and they don't want to negatively affect the value of their token by like making Kleros look bad by having a bribe get through. So these last 2 points, we don't expect to necessarily be true of future P plus epsilon attacks. So that's certainly something we're going to continue to monitor. So then we tested our system against a variety of interesting attacks. I recommend that you check out some of our blog posts if you're interested in knowing how we resisted against very different kinds of attacks. It didn't there were issues with like lazy voting attacks because like most of these submissions that were challenged were voted not Doge. There's a question of like, okay, if you just always vote not Doge, are you going to make money off of that? And in the end, our system is designed in such a way that like, because you only make like, you mostly get rewards if you vote, you mostly get rewards if you vote correctly in a case that's contentious. You don't get so many rewards by voting correctly in cases that everyone agrees on. So even though most of the cases vote not Doge, it's not necessarily like just voting not Doge all the time. You may still lose money because you're losing money on the contentious cases that were in fact Doges versus gaining small amounts of money on the other cases. So beyond that, we have a couple of maybe more interesting observations we made beyond just does the system resist attacks. So one of my favorite things that we observed during the months that we did this was this sort of story around sort of evidence and Venetian Doges. So if you might be familiar with Venetian history, at one point the Republic of Venice had a chief magistrate, which was called a Doge. So our list criteria that we asked people, asked our jurors, was does this image show a Doge? And arguably this guy, this Leonardo Lorden dude, belongs on the list because he was a Doge. So early on, someone submitted the image on the left, and it was rejected, 0 to 3. And later on, someone else submitted another image that just had this extra piece of text saying that this is Leonardo Lorden, and he was the Doge of Venice, 1501, 1521. And that was accepted unanimously. And so this is an interesting phenomenon. So for one thing, if I don't know about Venetian history and I get this extra information, I can go on Wikipedia, I can be like, oh yeah, he was a Doge, you know, he belongs on this list. So giving jurors extra information helps them make better choices, which is natural. But also something to note is that because we use a Schelling point system, you want to be coherent with what other people are going to vote. So even if you know Venetian history and you see the guy on the left without the explanation, you might say, okay, yeah, I know this is a Doge. I believe that's the right answer, but I don't think the other jurors are going to know that. So I'm going to vote not Doge because I think the other jurors are going to vote not Doge. And so I'll be coherent. But then when you see that everyone else knows that this guy has enough information to learn that this guy is a Doge, then you're less likely to underestimate the other jurors. And you can say, okay, well, I now have a higher degree of confidence that these other people are going to make the right decision because I see that they have good evidence. So this is very heartening because it gives a good sign that if you just give jurors good evidence, they're more likely to make good decisions. A couple other, so this is just recapping the things I just said. And we had some other interesting edge cases about contentious cases. So these images that had both dogs and cats were contentious because our payout policy for whether getting the reward for getting a cat image on the list specified that if the image could not also have the Doge to qualify for the payout, but the sort of subcourt policy didn't really talk about images like this. So there was sort of some contention among the juror community whether images like this should be on the list. And at first, there were some pretty disputed votes. Most of them got through, but then over time they got fewer and fewer votes for that said that yes, this is a Doge, and eventually they were all sort of rejected unanimously. So that shows that the jurors are sort of forming a sort of proto-precedent where they're looking at what's happened in the past. And because it's a Schelling point system and they're trying to emulate what the other jurors are going to do, this image from the behavior from the past informs them, and then they base how they vote on how similar cases were handled, which is good from a sort of predictability perspective. Ultimately, if you're submitting to the list, you're putting out a deposit, you probably like to have a good idea of whether your image is going to make it on or not. We have some arising research questions that come out of this. So particularly interesting are some questions we have around data availability attacks. So what happens when jurors don't have the same amount of information over the course of a voting period, maybe from one appeal to another, new information becomes available. There was this guy who tried to make submissions to us where the images were missing, and then he was going to submit the images later. And then that can troll people essentially, because if you're a challenger trying to flag the image, you don't know if it's going to be a Doge or not. And those kinds of things can cause problems. So we're still thinking about ways that we can sort of incentivize the flow of information correctly. Also, there were questions around how to appropriately incentivize people to flag the malicious images. Particularly, people were good about flagging malicious images at the beginning, but then as the pilot dragged on, people were less enthusiastic, and it was the flagging of malicious images became a problem. Okay, so that's all the things we did with Doges on trial, and then just to give you a sense of where we're going, what other things we're going to do with token curated lists moving forward. So just today, we launched a token curated list of tokens. So as you can see here, you can submit a token that basically when you submit the ticker, the name, the image that goes with the token, and most importantly, the address that corresponds to the token. And this way, you can create a sort of reviewed curated list of tokens attached to the right address. So if you're a scam token that's trying to convince someone that you're selling them a given token, but you have a wrong address, you as a user can go to this list, and you can check to see that the address is correct as verified by Kleros jurors. And then you can maybe do even more complicated things where you can check if a given token satisfies a list of properties to be sold. Does it satisfy its properties that could be qualified to be sold on a particular exchange, or some other properties like a list of curated of ERC20 tokens or whatever. So that's what we're doing now. I suppose I'll open it up to questions. Are there any questions?
Cool. Thanks so much, William. Cool, guys. Any questions from anyone in the audience?
Yeah, I'll ask a question. My understanding is that most Shelling point systems rely on the voters not being able to coordinate. How do you think about like the people participating in like the Doge curation? Like, how do you stop them from coordinating?
Yeah, so that's certainly yes, that's an issue. So ideally, in the long term, we would have like a commit and reveal voting system, which we didn't do for the Doges on trial because it creates usability problems because you have to like come back and commit and reveal. And even further than that, we've imagined ways where you could bet on votes of other people. So there's another post by Vitalik on like the sort of anti-pre-revelation games where you can like place a bet on how other people are going to vote. And then you can disincentivize giving people any information about how you're going to vote beyond sort of like what people know about average voting tendencies. So you're penalized sort of by how much people know about your vote as it deviates from the average. If like 60% of all votes are Doge, then as long as you vote Doge 60% of the time, you know, like people won't be able to penalize you via this game. But if you vote like on a given case in an aberrant way that's more predictable, then you're penalizable. So that might be a long-term thing we're going to do. In the short term, we think that our appeal system is a reasonably good defense against people coordinating, because people communicating, because ultimately you as a juror in Kleros want to be coherent with the ultimate ruling of the case. So if you're in the first round and you think that a malicious response would be appealed, then you're not really trying to be coherent with the other jurors in the current case, the people with whom you could talk on Telegram or who you could like check their vote on Etherscan. You're trying to be coherent with people in some hypothetical future round. And those people haven't necessarily been decided yet, so you can't communicate with them. But that only really works if you expect appeals of malicious decisions.
So in like the Doge of Venice case, let's say I'm like the one voter that recognizes the image, I would push that to an escalation round after like not being coherent in the first round of voting. And then in the escalation round, like everyone that was coherent would be penalized in some way? Yeah.
So all the people that were coherent in the first round but incoherent with the ultimate decision would be penalized because they weren't coherent with the ultimate decision. So if you're the Doge of Venice, if you're like the one person who recognizes the Doge of Venice as being like belonging on the list, ultimately your question that you're asking yourself is whether you think that it will win in like the ultimate appeal round, which if it's sort of contextless, it doesn't have evidence. You might think, okay, like I don't have a very high opinion of my other jurors. Maybe it won't win. Just because like it's not even so much that like I don't think the jurors in my current round will get it. It's that you don't think the juror pool on average will get it.
So there's no opportunity to provide it.
So in the next version, in the token curated list of tokens, we provide an opportunity at the beginning. There's an evidence period where anyone can submit evidence that basically so if you were the Doge of Venice voter, you could submit the Wikipedia article on the Doges of Venice, and then all the jurors will see that, and then you can sort of like provide the evidence that you would think the jurors would need to know.
Cool, thanks.
You're welcome.
Well, I'll ask one more question if it's silence. Did you know the identities of the people that you were testing the bribes on? Like, did they have reputation at stake?
Not well, some of them. I mean, so the pool of people that these bribes are being tested on was like a few dozen total people, and some of them we're like aware of because they participate in the Telegram community. We may or may not be able to tie a given person to a specific address. I think in theory, if we looked at our like ICO records and like who's KYC, we might be able to figure out like if a given person accepted the bribe, if like the tokens hadn't moved too much. But in practice, we did make an effort to tie people to their reputation and determine whether or not they were going to have a bribe. I'm not sure to what degree the jurors would have expected anonymity, but.
Yeah. There's a question from Angela in the chat asking what are the main research questions for token curated lists of tokens?
Yeah, so these are, so depending on exactly what kind of policy you want the token to satisfy to belong on the list, these are more difficult questions for the juror to have to answer. Like if you want a list of tokens that like aren't scams, then that might take a substantial amount of cognitive effort for the juror, which ultimately is what Kleros is designed for, to handle disputes that take some serious amount of effort to resolve. But then you really have to get into like calibrating parameters of the system in such a way that people are incentivized enough that they're willing to put in that effort, and they're not willing to do things like vote like the most likely choice every time, while still making sort of while still incentivizing people to submit to the list and not having like excessively high fees. So there's a lot of like parameter calibration.
Cool, thanks, William. Does that, Angela, is you good? Okay. There's another question on the chat as well from Matt asking, what are the main Oracle or off-chain knowledge challenges for both projects? Giveth, how do token holders trust project management and all progress? And Kleros, validity of evidence supplied, for example, deepfakes issues or to sway jurors. William, maybe you can go first and then we can switch over to Giveth for an answer to that one.
Yeah, sure. So like checking the validity of evidence is certainly a challenge. It depends a lot on the kind of the case. So like trying to prove that you're like a given token isn't like satisfies some kind of properties. Maybe that means looking at like the LinkedIn pages of founders and like, you know, reading the white paper, or like consulting like the company's website and like checking the certificate on the website is valid, so that's not spoofed. So like when you have purely digital evidence, you might reasonably expect a juror to be able to process all that. If you have other kinds of evidence that are off-chain, it becomes more difficult, and that's very much an open question of research.
Cool, thanks. Jeff, do you want to go ahead and answer the next part of the question?
Yeah, sure. So in our system, we are, a lot of this would be parent on chain as far as Commons progress, Commons work. We expect that if this becomes sort of a blank slate Commons stack that people can work off of, there will be successful Commons, there will be unsuccessful Commons, and basically the market will decide based on, what we are looking to do is to build a system that will allow emergent solutions to appear. So it's not, any regimented system that we are imposing. It is allowing and enabling behavior in all sorts of commons. So there will be kind of like a market response to, if there is a commons with poor project management and progress, then it will probably drop down in value. If there is another commons that is more successful, it will rise in value. So we're kind of enabling behavior rather than setting strict, yeah, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Answer the question, Matt, or no, that's a follow-up for Kleros. Yeah, basically everything would be on-chain within the Commons framework. We're probably thinking this would be on some sort of app that you could interact with the Commons as a user somewhere down the line. This isn't any near-term thinking. Obviously, we're still working on the building blocks of all this.
Sorry, Jeff, the chat was blocking my screen. Thanks for your answers, both you and the gentleman from Kleros. I forgot your name.
Thanks.
Cool. William, there's another question for you here as well. Could you see Kleros, could you foresee Kleros partnering with other protocols in the future, for example, like True Story for evidence verification outside of your core value proposition?
Yeah, totally. I mean, so we're open to partnering with other protocols. If we could find like a partnership that would allow us to like create better verified evidence and thus expand the kinds of the disputes that we could reasonably handle, that'd be great. So we're open to things like that, but nothing like that is specifically in the work, not with that specific partner, but that's the kind of thing we're open to.
That's great to hear.
Got to run. Thanks for answering those questions. Thanks, Devin.
Cheers, Matt. Thanks for coming. Cool, guys. We've actually reached as well like the time limit as well for the call coming to an end. I am happy as well to stay on the call with you guys as well if you would like to open up any other discussions from the community or ask any questions. So if anyone would like to intro one of their projects they're working on or discuss any ideas, you're welcome to chat now. And if not, then that's okay, cool. Then we can close it up and we'll see you guys next month. All right, cool.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks everybody. That was awesome.
And thank you, William and Jeff and Abby, for your presentations. They were great.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
More coming soon.
Cheers, everybody.
Bye.